October 25th, 1944. 8:30 in the morning. A gun barrel glows cherry red. Inside the steel mount, the temperature has climbed past 130 degrees. A powder charge detonates. Not from enemy fire, from heat. The breech has cooked off its own ammunition. The explosion rips through 10 men like a grenade in a phone booth. 3 die instantly. 7 collapse bleeding. And a 20-year-old gunner named Paul Henry Carr from Chakota, Oklahoma, a kid who joined the Navy because he had nothing else, catches a piece of jagged steel from his neck to his groin. His intestines spill onto the deck. He is dying. But what Paul Carr does next in the final 5 minutes of his life will become one of the most legendary acts of defiance in the entire history of naval warfare. He crawls, not away from the destroyed gun, toward it. Toward the last shell, toward one final act of war against the largest battleship ever built. This is the story of how a ship smaller than a fishing trawler charged the most powerful fleet Japan ever assembled, and how 4 ordinary sailors, a farm boy, a mechanic, an engineer, and a gunner, did something so insane that the entire Japanese Navy turned around and ran. But to understand how Paul Carr ended up dying on that burning deck holding a shell he could never fire, we need to go back. Not just hours, months. We need to understand the catastrophic chain of failures, miscalculations, and one admiral's enormous blunder that left the thinnest possible line of American ships standing between 200,000 tons of Japanese steel and the greatest military disaster of the Pacific War. By October 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached its most critical phase. General Douglas MacArthur was returning to the Philippines. He had promised it 2 years ago when he fled Corregidor in a PT boat, leaving behind 70,000 American and Filipino soldiers who would endure the Bataan Death March. Now he was back with 700 ships and 200,000 troops. The landings at Leyte Gulf began October 20th. 4 days of continuous operations. Troops pouring ashore. Supplies stacking up on beaches. The entire invasion depended on one thing: control of the sea around Leyte. If the Japanese Navy broke through to the landing beaches, they could destroy. The transport ships cut off the troops on shore, turned MacArthur's triumphant return into a massacre. And the Japanese knew it. They threw everything they had left into one final desperate operation. Shogo 1. Victory Operation. 4 separate naval forces converging on Leyte Gulf from different directions. It was the largest naval battle in human history. 282 ships. 200,000 sailors. Spread across 100,000 square miles of ocean. The most powerful of these Japanese forces was the center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. 23 warships. 4 battleships including Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest warships ever constructed. 6 heavy cruisers. 2 light cruisers. 11 destroyers. Total displacement 200,000 tons. Yamato alone weighed 72,000 tons. Her 9 18.1-inch guns could fire shells weighing 3,200 pounds over 25 miles. A single shell from Yamato weighed more than a small car. One broadside could level a city block. This was the force heading for Leyte Gulf. And on the night of October 24th, one man made a decision that nearly lost the entire battle. Admiral William Bull Halsey commanded the United States Third Fleet. He had 6 fast battleships, multiple fleet carriers, the most powerful naval force in the world. His job was simple: guard San Bernardino Strait. That was the doorway Kurita's center force had to pass through to reach the landing beaches. Keep that door shut, and the invasion was safe. But Halsey saw something he wanted more than safety: Japanese carriers. Admiral Ozawa's Northern Force. 4 carriers with barely any planes was dangling itself north of Luzon like bait. It was bait. The entire point of Ozawa's force was to lure Halsey away from San Bernardino Strait, to pull those American battleships north to open the door for Kurita. And Halsey took the bait. Every single battleship. Every single carrier. He pulled them all north. He left San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. He didn't tell anyone. The commanders at Leyte Gulf assumed Halsey had left a force behind. He hadn't. The only ships between Kurita's 23 warships and the defenseless transports at Leyte were the escort carriers of Task Unit 77.4.3. Call sign Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers. Converted merchant ship hulls with flat tops welded on. 3 destroyers. 4 destroyer escorts. Total tonnage, 25,000 tons against 200,000 tons. The Japanese outweighed them 8-1. But nobody on Taffy 3 knew any of this yet. Not until 6:45 on the morning of October 25th, when an anti-submarine patrol pilot radioed back a contact report that made no sense. Japanese battleships, due north, closing fast. The pilot must be wrong. Japanese battleships couldn't be here. Intelligence said Kurita's force had turned back after air attacks the previous day. Halsey's battleships were guarding the strait. Weren't they? At 6:58 a.m., lookouts aboard USS Samuel B. Roberts confirmed the nightmare. Pagoda masts on the horizon. Unmistakable. Japanese battleships. 15 miles away and closing at 30 knots. The Roberts was a destroyer escort. Hull number DE-413. Displacement 1,745 tons. Length 306 feet. Armed with 2 5-inch guns, 3 torpedo tubes, and depth charges designed to kill submarines. Her hull plating was so thin, a determined man could punch through it. Her crew numbered 224 men, average age 22. Most had never seen combat. They had been together exactly 5 months and 27 days since the ship was commissioned. And now they were staring at Yamato. The man who had to decide what to do with this tiny ship was Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland. He was not a career warrior. Before the war, Copeland was a lawyer from Tacoma, Washington. He joined the Naval Reserve because he thought it was his duty. He had never commanded a ship in combat. He had never fired a shot in anger. But in the next 3 hours, Robert Copeland would make decisions that admirals study at war colleges to this day. Copeland picked up the ship's intercom. His voice reached every compartment, every passageway, every man aboard. He told them the truth. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, multiple destroyers, all closing on our position. He paused. Then he said the words that would define the Samuel B. Roberts forever. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. We will do what damage we can. No sugarcoating. No false hope. Just the truth and a promise. We will fight. Below decks, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Lloyd Trowbridge heard every word, and Trowbridge immediately understood the math. The Roberts was rated for 24 knots. Navy regulations. Safety specifications. The boilers had limiters installed to prevent exceeding design parameters. 24 knots against ships that could make 30. You cannot fight what you cannot catch. You cannot dodge what you cannot outrun. Trowbridge looked at his engineering crew. Then he walked to the main control panel and started ripping out every safety system the United States Navy had installed. Bypass the pressure limiters. Override the temperature cutoffs. Disconnect the automatic shutdowns. His men watched. Nobody questioned it. Nobody hesitated. They understood exactly what their chief engineer was doing. He was turning their ship into a bomb. If the boilers failed at overpressure, the explosion would kill everyone in the engine room. But if they stayed at 24 knots, Japanese shells would kill everyone on the ship. Trowbridge chose the risk that came with a chance. Within minutes, the Roberts was making 28.5 knots. 4.5 knots beyond anything the designers had ever intended. Steam pressure gauges buried themselves in the red zone and stayed there. The hull vibrated. Pipes groaned. Metal screamed. Trowbridge stood at his station, watching gauges that could kill him, keeping his ship alive by sheer force of will. At 7:05 a.m., Admiral Clifton Sprague gave the order no one wanted to hear. Small boys attack. Screen make smoke. The three destroyers turned toward the enemy first. USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee from Oklahoma who had told his crew at commissioning that he intended to go in harm's way. USS Howell. USS Heermann. Behind them came the four destroyer escorts. Samuel B. Roberts was last in line, 7 ships, total, against 23. The plan, if you could call it a plan, was suicidal. The destroyers and destroyer escorts would charge directly at the Japanese fleet fire torpedoes at point-blank range, use their 5-inch guns to harass and confuse, and try to buy enough time for the escort carriers to run south toward help that might not exist. In the entire Pacific War, no destroyer escort had ever engaged enemy battleships. The doctrine manual didn't even have a section for it. Destroyer escorts were designed to hunt submarines. Slow, methodical, patient work. Listening on sonar. Dropping depth charges. Not this. Not charging into the guns of the most powerful surface fleet in the world. At 7:16 a.m., Johnston fired first. 5-inch shells arced toward the Japanese formation. Enemy fire came back immediately. 14-inch rounds from battleship Congo. The water erupted in columns 200 feet tall. Johnston disappeared behind walls of spray. At 7:23 a.m., Copeland ordered the Roberts to flank speed. Trowbridge's engines answered, 28 knots. The deck shuddered. The wake boiled white behind them. They were running toward the guns. Gun. Captain Lieutenant William Burton stood in the forward 5-inch mount with his 10-man crew. Average age 22. 2 had never been in combat. Burton had 304 rounds of ammunition for his gun. At maximum rate of fire, 15 rounds per minute, that gave him exactly 20 minutes and 16 seconds of shooting. After that, the gun was a paperweight. Burton didn't think about 20 minutes. He thought about the next round. Load. Ram. Fire. That was his entire universe now. At 7:38 a.m., Copeland announced they were closing for torpedo attack. The Roberts was 7,000 yards from heavy cruiser Chikuma. Still 2,000 yards too far. 2 more minutes of running straight into 8-inch shells. The splashes were getting closer. Green dye markers in the water told Burton the Japanese spotters were correcting their aim. 1 shell landed 50 yards to port, another 20 yards to starboard. They were being bracketed. The next salvo could be a direct hit. Copeland held course, steady, straight, into the fire. At 7:40 a.m., the Roberts crossed the magic number. 5,000 yards. Torpedo range. Copeland gave the order. 3 Mark 15 torpedoes launched from the starboard tubes. White wakes streaked across the water at 46 knots. The Roberts immediately threw her rudder hard left, turned away, ran for the smoke screen. Behind them, Chikuma's lookouts spotted the torpedo tracks. The cruiser heeled into an emergency turn. 8,000 tons, slamming her rudder to maximum deflection. The first torpedo missed ahead. The second missed astern. The third ran underneath without detonating. 40% failure rate on contact exploders. 3 shots. 3 duds. But it didn't matter. Chikuma had turned away. She had broken off her attack run on the carriers. She had lost 5 critical minutes of pursuit time. 5 minutes the escort carriers used to run. 5 minutes closer to survival. The Roberts emerged from the smoke at 7:45 a.m. Torpedoes gone. Forward gun down to 270 rounds. Aft gun still full. The Japanese fleet spread across the horizon in every direction. Cruisers closing from 3 sides. Battleships behind them. And somewhere in that wall of steel, Yamato's 18-inch guns were looking for targets. Copeland turned to Burton. Open fire. And for the next 35 minutes, 2 5-inch guns on a ship that weighed less than Yamato's anchor fought a running battle against 6 heavy cruisers and 4 battleships. What happened next would push every man aboard the Samuel B. Roberts beyond the limits of human endurance, beyond the limits of what the Navy thought possible, beyond the limits of what anyone thought a tiny ship could survive. But survival was never the point. In Part 2, we will see the Roberts take her first devastating hit. We will watch Paul Carr's gun crew fight with no electricity, no hydraulics, nothing but muscle and fury. We will witness the moment a 20-year-old gunner from Oklahoma with his body torn open and his life bleeding out onto the deck crawled toward his last shell and refused to die until he had fired one more round at the enemy. And we will learn what happened to the 109 men who went into the water when the Samuel B. Roberts finally went down, and the 50 horrifying hours they spent drifting in shark-infested seas, waiting for rescue that almost never came. In Part 1, a destroyer escort, smaller than a tugboat, charged the largest battleship ever built. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland told his crew survival could not be expected. Chief Engineer Trowbridge ripped out every safety system to squeeze 4 extra knots from engines that were never designed for this. Gun Captain Burton fired 304 rounds from the forward mount until the barrel glowed red and the ammunition ran dry. 3 torpedoes launched at heavy cruiser Chikuma. 3 duds. But Chikuma turned away. 5 minutes bought. 5 minutes of life for the carriers running south. The Roberts emerged from the smokescreen at 7:45 a.m. with her forward gun nearly empty and Japanese cruisers closing from 3 directions. But what happened next made the torpedo run look like a warm-up exercise, because the Samuel B. Roberts was about to enter a 45-minute nightmare that would test every man aboard beyond the breaking point of human endurance. And 4 sailors were about to do things that the United States Navy still teaches at Annapolis 80 years later. At 7:52 a.m., Copeland faced a decision that had no good answer. The forward 5-inch gun under Burton had 34 rounds remaining. The aft gun under gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr still had a full magazine 325 rounds. But ammunition was only half the problem. The real problem was geometry. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers had the Roberts triangulated. Chikuma to the north at 8,000 yards. Tone to the northeast at 7,000 yards. Haguro to the northwest, closing fast. Each cruiser mounted 8-inch guns. Each could fire 10 rounds per minute. That meant 30 shells per minute converging on one tiny ship from 3 different directions. You cannot zigzag away from 3 enemies simultaneously. Turn away from one, you turn toward another. Copeland chose the only option that made tactical sense. He chose the option that was insane. He turned toward Tone. Not away. Toward. Close the range. Get inside the cruiser's minimum gun depression. Make it harder for the Japanese gunners to depress their barrels low enough to hit a target that was practically underneath them. It was the same logic a boxer uses when he steps inside a taller fighter's reach. Get close enough and those long arms become useless. The problem was getting there alive. Copeland ordered Burton to shift fire to Tone. The forward mount swung to the new bearing. 7,000 yards. Burton had 34 rounds to make count. He couldn't waste a single shell. He fired. The first round arced across the water, struck Tone's number 2 turret, penetrated the armored face, detonated inside. The turret stopped rotating, stopped firing. 1 shot, 1 hit, 1/4 of the cruiser's main battery disabled by a 5-inch gun that, according to every naval manual ever written, was not supposed to be capable of damaging a heavy cruiser's turret armor. Burton had just done the impossible, but he knew something else too. He had 33 rounds left, 2 minutes and 12 seconds of fire. Then his gun was a piece of sculpture. At the aft mount, Paul Carr was doing what Paul Carr did, fighting. His 10-man crew had been firing continuously since 7:45. 15 rounds per minute. Mechanical precision. Load the 54-pound shell. Ram it into the breech. Close the breech block. Fire. Absorb 8 tons of recoil. Eject the brass casing. Do it again, and again, and again. Carr was 20 years old. He had grown up in Checotah, Oklahoma, a town so small it barely appeared on state maps. His father worked oil fields. Paul joined the Navy in May 1942 because there was nothing in Checotah for a 17-year-old kid who wanted to matter. He trained at Great Lakes Naval Training Station, qualified as a gunner, got assigned to the Roberts in April 1944, 6 months ago. He had never fired at another ship, never been fired at. His entire combat experience consisted of tracking submarine contacts on sonar. But standing in that gun mount on the morning of October 25th, Paul Carr fought like he had been doing this his entire life. His crew followed his rhythm. His voice called the cadence. Load, ram, fire, load, ram, fire. The barrel heated. The mount shook. Brass casings piled up ankle-deep on the deck plates. Carr kicked them aside, kept firing. At 8:03 a.m., Destroyer Johnston took a catastrophic hit. A 14-inch shell from battleship Congo struck her bridge. The explosion killed the executive officer instantly. Commander Ernest Evans, the Cherokee captain who had promised to go in harm's way, was wounded. Shrapnel tore into his hand, his face. Johnston's speed dropped to 17 knots. She kept fighting. 3 miles north, Destroyer Hoel was dying. Multiple hits had destroyed her forward gun mount, flooded the No. 3 engine room. She was making 15 knots on one engine, listing badly. Hoel would sink at 8:55 a.m., with 253 of her 339 crew. The screen was being destroyed ship by ship, and the Roberts was next in line. At 8:10 a.m., Burton fired his last round from the forward mount. 304 shells expended. The barrel was so hot the metal had changed color, dull red fading to orange at the muzzle. The recoil springs were compressed beyond specification. Oil smoked in the recuperator. The forward gun was finished. Everything now depended on Carr's aft mount. One gun, 325 rounds, against 6 heavy cruisers and 4 battleships. Carr kept firing. At 8:15 a.m., the Japanese found their range. Chikuma Tone and Haguro had the Roberts bracketed from 3 sides. 6,000 yards. 5,000. 4,000. The shells were falling closer with every salvo. Green dye markers in the splashes. Red dye markers. Each cruiser used different colors so their spotters could distinguish their own shells from the others. The ocean around the Roberts turned into a rainbow of colored water columns. Beautiful. Deadly. Copeland zigzagged. Hard left. Hard right. Full rudder each way. The ship heeled over at each turn, the deck tilting 30 degrees. Men grabbed stanchions, held on, kept working. The ship was a living thing now, writhing, dodging, fighting to stay alive one more minute. One more turn. One more salvo dodged. At 8:20 a.m., the first hit came. An 8-inch shell from Chikuma struck the Roberts amidships port side. It punched through the hull plating like a fist through wet cardboard. Traveled through the galley. Pots, pans. The coffee urn that machinist mate George Carbon had filled at 6:30 that morning. The shell exited the starboard side without detonating. A dud. Just like the Roberts' own torpedoes. A 3-foot hole on each side. Seawater poured in. Damage control teams scrambled. Mattresses jammed into the breaches. Wooden shores braced against buckling steel. The Roberts took a 5-degree list to port. She was wounded, but she was alive, and Carr was still firing. 2 minutes later, the second shell hit. This one was not a dud. It detonated inside the crew's berthing compartment. The explosion killed 6 men in the space of a heartbeat. Ruptured steam lines. Superheated steam at 400 degrees flooded the passageway. 4 more sailors were scalded, screaming, skin peeling. The Roberts' speed dropped. 24 knots. Then 20. One boiler offline. Trowbridge, the engineer who had bypassed every safety system, was now fighting to keep the remaining boiler from failing. If it went, the ship was dead in the water. A stationary target. He stayed at his post, adjusting valves, monitoring pressures, keeping the heart of the ship beating through sheer will. At 8:25 a.m., the aft gun mount lost electrical power. The hit that killed 6 men had severed the power cables running to Carr's mount. Everything stopped. The power train that rotated the turret. The hydraulic ram that loaded shells. The electrical firing mechanism. All dead. Carr's gun was now a manual weapon. 18th century technology in a 20th century battle. His crew didn't hesitate. They had trained for this. Every destroyer escort crew drilled on manual operation. The trainer and pointer grabbed the hand crank, started turning. Muscle against steel. Each degree of rotation required 20 full turns of the crank handle. The loader and rammer lifted each 54-pound shell by hand. No hydraulic assist, pure human strength, and shoved it into the breech. The gun captain Carr himself manually triggered the firing pin. Rate of fire dropped from 15 rounds per minute to 6. Maybe 7 if the crew pushed themselves to collapse. Carr's crew pushed themselves to collapse. Load, crank, ram, fire. Load, crank, ram, fire. The barrel was glowing red. Heat radiated through the mount like an open furnace. Temperature inside climbed past 130 degrees. The men were drenched, sweat, seawater from near misses pouring through the gun ports, steam leaking from ruptured lines below. They breathed in air that burned their lungs. And they kept firing. At 8:30 a.m., the gun killed its own crew. The breech had absorbed so much heat that a powder charge ignited spontaneously. Cooked off before the breech was fully closed. The explosion ripped through the mount from the inside. 3 men died where they stood. 7 others were thrown against the bulkheads, shrapnel tearing through them. The blast caught Paul Carr across the torso. A jagged piece of steel opened him from neck to groin. He hit the deck. His intestines were exposed. Blood pooled around him. He was dying, and he knew it. But Paul Carr looked at the ammunition rack. 1 shell, the last round in the magazine. 54 pounds of high explosive. And the breech was shattered. The firing mechanism was destroyed. There was physically no way to fire that shell. It didn't matter. Carr crawled toward it. Dragged himself across the bloody deck with his insides spilling out. He grabbed the shell. Couldn't lift it. Couldn't stand. He pressed it against his chest. Held it like a child holds something precious. And he looked at the destroyed breech with an expression that every man who saw it would remember for the rest of their lives. Load it. Fire it. Keep fighting. Machinist mate 2nd class. Chalmer Goheen found him there, holding the shell, begging. Goheen tried to take the shell, tried to pull Carr away from the wrecked mount. Carr refused. He kept pointing at the breech, kept trying to make Goheen understand that there was 1 more round and it needed to go down range. 1 more shell at the enemy. 1 more act of defiance. Goheen finally pried the shell from Carr's hands, set it down, dragged Carr away from the mount. The gun was finished. The crew was finished. Paul Carr died 5 minutes later, still trying to crawl back to his gun. He was 20 years old. At 8:35 a.m., a 14-inch shell from either Congo or Haruna struck the Roberts' starboard side. The massive round penetrated the No. 2 engine room and detonated. The explosion tore a hole 40 feet long and 10 feet wide. The engine room flooded in 30 seconds. 8 men killed instantly. Speed dropped to 10 knots, then 5, then nothing. Dead in the water. Copeland ordered all remaining crew topside. The ship was finished. No power. No steering. 3 feet of water in the lower decks. Fires burning in 4 compartments. The Roberts was settling by the stern, sinking slowly, dying the way warships die. But the Japanese were not done. At 8:45 a.m., more shells hit. 6-inch rounds from light cruiser Noshiro. 8-inch rounds from Haguro. They were hammering a ship that could no longer fight, could no longer move, could no longer do anything but absorb punishment. Each hit killed more men. Each explosion sent more shrapnel through compartments where wounded sailors lay waiting for help that would never come. At 9:10 a.m., Copeland gave the order. Abandon ship. 115 men were already dead or missing. 109 remained. They had 3 inflatable life rafts. 2 had been destroyed by shell fire. 1 remained designed for 16 men. They put the wounded in the raft. Everyone else went over the side into water covered with thick black fuel oil from ruptured tanks. At 9:35 a.m., the Samuel B. Roberts rolled to port. Her bow rose out of the water, pointing at the sky like a finger accusing heaven. She hung there for 10 seconds. Then she slipped under. Stern first. The bow followed. 306 feet of warship swallowed by the Philippine Sea in 600 fathoms. 3,600 feet. The deepest any American warship had been sunk in combat until that day. 109 men floating in the ocean. Wounded, burned, covered in oil. No food, no water, no rescue. The battle was still raging around them. Japanese warships steamed past without stopping. And then something happened that nobody on Taffy 3 had dared to hope for. At 9:45 a.m., Admiral Kurita ordered the Japanese center force to withdraw. His cruisers were battered. Chokai dead in the water. Chikuma burning. Suzuya's torpedoes had cooked off from a near miss. Kumano's bow blown away. The tiny ships of Taffy 3 had done so much damage that Kurita believed he was fighting fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. His staff insisted they were engaging Halsey's Third Fleet. They were wrong. They were fighting escort carriers made from merchant ship hulls and destroyer escorts that weighed less than Yamato's anchor chain. But the confusion, the smoke, the ferocity of the American attack had convinced the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific to turn around and run. The battle off Samar was over. 3 American ships sunk. Roberts, Johnston, Hoel. Escort carrier Gambier Bay capsized under Yamato's 18-inch guns. 277 Americans dead or missing. But MacArthur's invasion fleet survived. The troops kept landing. The supplies kept flowing. The Japanese had thrown everything they had at Leyte Gulf and lost. But for 109 men drifting in the Philippine Sea, the war was not over. It was about to enter a new kind of hell. A hell with no guns, no enemies, you could fight no ship beneath your feet. Just open ocean-burning sun, black oil in your lungs, and 50 hours of waiting, because the sharks arrived at 2 p.m. Small ones first. Black-tip reef sharks, 6 feet long, circling, bumping, testing. Then the big ones came. Tiger sharks, bull sharks, 8 feet, 10 feet. And the men of the Samuel B. Roberts, who had just fought the most powerful fleet in the world, now faced an enemy they could not shoot, could not outrun, could not even see beneath the oil-slicked water. In Part 3, we will enter those 50 hours. We will learn what Copeland did to keep his men alive when hallucinations set in, when men started drinking seawater, when 2 sailors vanished in the night, and nobody wanted to say why. We will learn about the patrol craft that finally found them, and the one question that separated rescue from a burst of machine gun fire. And we will learn what happened to the men who survived the medals they received, and the ship the Navy named after a 20-year-old gunner from Oklahoma, who died holding a shell he could never fire. In Part 1, a destroyer escort weighing less than Yamato's anchor chain charged the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever assembled. In Part 2, the Samuel B. Roberts fought for 45 minutes against 6 heavy cruisers and 4 battleships until a 20-year-old gunner from Oklahoma died holding the last shell he could never fire. The ship went down at 9:35 a.m. on October 25, 1944. 109 men went into the water. No food, no fresh water. 1 life raft designed for 16. And the sharks arrived at 2 p.m. But the battle off Samar had already accomplished something that no one, not the Americans, not the Japanese, not the admirals studying their charts hundreds of miles away, fully understood yet. 7 tiny ships had just turned back 23 warships and saved an entire invasion fleet. The Japanese center force was retreating through San Bernardino Strait, and the men who made it happen were floating in the Philippine Sea, dying one by one, waiting for rescue that would not come for 50 hours. The water was warm, 84 degrees. That was the only mercy the Philippine Sea offered on October 25th. Warm enough to survive. for a while. 109 men spread across a quarter-mile of open ocean. Small clusters. 2 men clinging to a wooden plank. 5 men wrapped around a floater net. 10 men treading water near the single remaining life raft that was already overloaded with wounded. The fuel oil was everywhere. Thick black crude from the Roberts' ruptured tanks. It coated the surface of the water in a slick that extended 200 yards in every direction. It got into everything. Eyes. Burning, stinging temporary blindness. Men rubbed their eyes and made it worse, pushing the oil deeper. Mouths. Swallowing even a small amount triggered violent vomiting. Some men couldn't stop. They retched until their stomachs were empty, then kept retching. Dry heaves that tore at abdominal muscles already exhausted from hours of combat. Lungs. Breathing near the surface meant inhaling oil vapor, coughing, choking, the taste of petroleum coating every breath. Lieutenant Commander Copeland was in the water with his men. He had been the last officer to leave the ship. Now he was the senior surviving officer in a quarter-mile of ocean with no ship, no radio, no way to signal for help. The battle was still visible to the north. Smoke columns, distant gunfire. Japanese warships steaming away. None of them stopped. Copeland gathered the men he could reach, started organizing. He divided the survivors into groups, assigned leaders to each group, established a count-off system. Every hour, every man had to respond when his name was called. Anyone who didn't respond got checked, shaken, woken up, kept alive, because falling asleep in the water meant drowning. Your head drops. Water enters your nose. Your lungs fill. You sink. It happens quietly. Nobody notices until the next count, and someone doesn't answer. Copeland was not going to let that happen. The wounded were the worst. Burns from steamline ruptures, shrapnel wounds from shell detonations, broken bones from blast concussions. All of them crammed into a life raft designed for 16 men now holding 23. The raft sat low in the water waves, washing over the sides, soaking men whose burns were already infected from fuel oil exposure. In tropical water at 84 degrees, bacteria multiplied exponentially. Open wounds turned septic within hours. The smell of infection mixed with the smell of fuel oil and vomit. Men screamed. Others went quiet, slipping into shock, their bodies shutting down. At 2:00 p.m., 5 hours after the Roberts sank, the sharks found them. Small ones first. Blacktip reef sharks, 6 feet long. They circled the outer edges of the survivor group, bumping into legs, testing, investigating. Sharks detect blood in water at concentrations of 1 part per million. There was blood everywhere. From wounds. From cuts on hands torn by rough rope on the floater nets. From men who had bitten through their own lips during the battle. The blacktips circled closer. One sailor desperate to swim more easily in the heavy oil stripped off his clothes. White skin flashed beneath the black surface. A shark nudged his leg. Hard. The man panicked, scrambled back onto the floater net, sliced his hands open on the rope. More blood in the water. By late afternoon, the larger sharks arrived. Tiger sharks. Bull sharks. 8 feet. 10 feet. Shadows moving beneath the oil slick. You couldn't see them until they were right underneath you. The oil that was poisoning the men was also hiding the predators. Survivors reported bumps against their legs. Hard nudges that spun men around in the water, something brushing against a foot, a tail sweeping past a torso. The terror was not knowing, not being able to see what was below, not knowing if the next bump would be followed by teeth. 2 men disappeared during the first night. No warning. Splashing. Thrashing. A sound that could have been a scream muffled by oil and water. Then silence. Nobody saw what happened. Nobody wanted to confirm what they already knew. In the morning, 2 men were simply gone. Their life jackets floated empty. Night brought a different kind of suffering. The water temperature dropped to 78 degrees. Not cold enough to kill a healthy man. But these were not healthy men. They were wounded, dehydrated, exhausted, poisoned by fuel oil. Hypothermia crept in slowly. Core temperature dropping degree by degree. Shivering started, then confusion, then lethargy. 3 more men died during the first night. Wounds, shock, exposure. Their bodies were gently pushed away from the raft, away from the nets, released into the darkness, drifting away, gone. Copeland said a prayer for each one, then called the next count, kept the living awake, kept them talking, kept them connected to each other and to the idea that rescue would come. October 26th, the second day. The sun rose like a furnace being opened. Temperature climbed above 90 degrees. The oil on the men's skin trapped the heat. They were being slow cooked. Dehydration was now critical. The human body can survive approximately 3 days without water under normal conditions. These were not normal conditions. Vomiting from oil ingestion had accelerated fluid loss. Sweating in the tropical heat. Exertion from treading water. Some men were losing fluid faster than their bodies could compensate. Hallucinations began. One man pointed at the horizon and shouted that he could see a destroyer coming to rescue them. There was nothing there. Another insisted he could see the coast of Samar. It was 40 miles away. A third man began swimming toward an island that didn't exist. 2 others grabbed him, held him, pulled him back to the group. He fought them, screamed that they were letting him die. They held on until he stopped struggling. 5 more men died on the second day, some from wounds that had worsened overnight. Some from dehydration so severe their organs began shutting down. Some simply stopped. Their hearts gave out. Their bodies surrendered. Copeland counted the living after each death. The number kept shrinking. 109 became 104, then 101, then 98, then 95. 14 dead in the water. 14 men who had survived Japanese battleships, cruisers, and destroyers only to die floating in the ocean waiting for someone to notice they were missing. But Copeland held the rest together. He talked to them, made them talk to each other, told jokes that weren't funny but made men laugh anyway because laughing meant you were alive. He assigned tasks. Watch for aircraft. Watch for ships. Keep count. Keep moving. Don't fall asleep. Don't drink seawater. Seawater was the great temptation. Surrounded by water you cannot drink. The salt concentration in seawater is roughly 4 times what the human kidney can process. Drinking it accelerates dehydration, causes hallucinations, leads to kidney failure, kills you faster than drinking nothing at all. Copeland repeated this every hour. Don't drink the water. Don't drink the water. Some men listened. Some didn't. The ones who drank seawater deteriorated rapidly. Confusion, delirium, seizures. They died faster than anyone else. The second night passed, more cold, more fear, more shadows beneath the oil. Copeland kept counting, kept calling names, kept shaking men awake. He had not slept in over 40 hours, had not eaten, had not had fresh water. He was running on something beyond physical endurance, something that kept him upright in the water when his body wanted to surrender. Call it duty. Call it stubbornness. Call it love for the men who had followed him into impossible odds and deserved to be brought home alive. October 27th, 7:45 in the morning. 50 hours and 10 minutes since the Roberts went down. Patrol craft PC-1119 was escorting 5 landing craft infantry through waters north of Samar. Routine convoy duty. The lookout, a 19-year-old seaman whose name history did not record, saw something in the water. Wreckage, debris, oil, then shapes, bodies, life jackets. He called it out. The patrol craft altered course, approached slowly, cautiously. Japanese survivors had been known to play dead, then attack rescuers with grenades or pistols. The PC stopped 50 yards away. An officer called out across the water. "Identify yourselves." Silence. Then a voice hoarse cracked, barely audible. "American, United States Navy." The officer wasn't satisfied. He needed proof. He asked the one question no Japanese sailor could answer. Who won the World Series? The voice came back stronger this time with something that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. St. Louis Cardinals. The patrol craft moved in. Rescue took 4 hours. 95 men pulled from the water one at a time. Some couldn't grab the ropes thrown to them. Their hands were too slippery with oil, too weak from dehydration, too damaged from gripping rope and steel for 50 hours. Sailors from the PC jumped into the water and carried them. Some survivors couldn't walk when they reached the deck. Couldn't stand. Had to be carried below and laid on every flat surface available. All were treated for dehydration. Burns, wounds, infections, fuel oil poisoning. The most serious cases were transferred to hospital ship USS Comfort. The rest were transported to Leyte, then to San Francisco aboard the transport Lurline. They arrived December 4, 1944. 3 weeks before Christmas. 5 weeks and 4 days after their ship went down. The battle off Samar sent shockwaves through both navies. The Japanese had committed their most powerful surface fleet to a decisive engagement and lost. Not to American battleships, not to fleet carriers, to escort carriers built on merchant ship hulls and destroyer escorts that displaced less than 2% of Yamato's tonnage. Admiral Kurida's decision to withdraw at 9:45 a.m. remains one of the most debated moments in naval history. His cruisers had taken catastrophic damage from ships that should not have been capable of inflicting it. Chokai sunk. Chikuma sunk. She went down later that day from damage that included hits from the Roberts 5-inch guns. Suzuya scuttled after her torpedoes cooked off. Kumano limping north with her bow destroyed. 4 heavy cruisers knocked out of the war by 7 small ships and a handful of aircraft armed with depth charges and general-purpose bombs. The Japanese Navy never recovered. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Yamato herself would make one final suicidal sortie toward Okinawa in April 1945 and be sunk by American aircraft without ever firing her main guns at an enemy ship again. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, reviewed the reports from Samar and called it the Navy's finest hour. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison, who wrote the definitive 15-volume history of the United States Navy in World War II, declared that no engagement in the history of naval warfare showed more gallantry, guts, and gumption. The Samuel B. Roberts received the Presidential Unit Citation. Every man who served aboard her that morning was honored. Lieutenant Commander Copeland received the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. Paul Henry Carr received the Silver Star posthumously for conspicuous gallantry. The citation described how he continued to fight his gun after losing power, continued after the mount was destroyed, continued with fatal wounds, continued until death took him with a shell in his arms. The numbers told the story in the starkest possible terms. 7 American ships engaged 23 Japanese warships. 3 American ships sunk. Roberts, Johnston, Howell. 1 escort carrier Gambier Bay lost. 1,277 American sailors killed or missing. But the invasion fleet survived. MacArthur's 200,000 troops continued landing. The Philippines campaign continued. The war in the Pacific was shortened by months. Military historians estimate that if Kurida's force had reached the transports at Leyte, the resulting destruction could have delayed the liberation of the Philippines by 6 months and prolonged the Pacific War well into 1946. The men of Taffy 3, including 224 sailors aboard a ship that cost the Navy $5.7 million to build, had prevented a disaster whose cost would have been measured in tens of thousands of lives. But what happened to the men who survived? What happened to the families who lost sons and husbands and brothers in the waters off Samar? What happened to the legacy of a 20-year-old gunner from Chakota, Oklahoma, who died crawling toward a gun he could never fire? And what happened 78 years later, when an explorer named Victor Vescovo descended 4 miles into the Philippine Sea and found the Samuel B. Roberts sitting upright on the ocean floor, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered, deeper than Titanic, with Carr's aft gun mount still visible, still there, still waiting in the silent dark. In Part 4, we will follow the survivors home. We will learn about the ship the Navy named after Paul Carr and the ship they named after Robert Copeland. We will hear from the last living survivor, Adred Lenoir, who died in March 2022 at age 97, 3 months before they found his ship. And we will stand on the ocean floor 22,621 feet down, where a tiny destroyer escort that fought like a battleship rests in the deepest grave the sea has ever given a warship. The final chapter of the Samuel B. Roberts is the one that no one expected. And it begins not in 1944, but in 2022. A destroyer escort that weighed less than 2% of Yamato's tonnage charged the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific. Her engineer ripped out every safety system to squeeze 4 extra knots from engines that were never designed to fight battleships. Her gun crews fired until the barrels glowed red and the ammunition ran dry. Her 20-year-old gunner died crawling toward a shell he could never fire. And when the Samuel B. Roberts finally went down, 109 men spent 50 hours floating in shark-infested waters before a patrol craft found them and asked who won the World Series. That was the battle. That was the survival. But the story of the Samuel B. Roberts has one final chapter, and it stretches across 8 decades from the waters off Samar in 1944 to the deepest point any shipwreck has ever been found. Because what happened after the battle to the men who survived, to the families who didn't get their sons back, and to the ship itself resting 4 miles beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, is perhaps the most extraordinary part of all. The 95 survivors of the Samuel B. Roberts arrived in San Francisco on December 4, 1944, aboard the transport USS Lurline. They walked down the gangplank into a country that had no idea what had happened off Samar. The battle had been classified. Details were suppressed. The Navy did not want the American public to know how close they had come to disaster. How Admiral Halsey had left San Bernardino Strait unguarded. How a handful of escort carriers and destroyer escorts had been left alone to face the Japanese center force. The survivors went home to families who asked what happened and got answers that were vague, incomplete, carefully edited. Some men couldn't talk about it at all. Not because of classification, because the words wouldn't come. How do you explain to your mother what it sounds like when a 14-inch shell hits the compartment next to yours? How do you describe the smell of burning oil mixed with burning flesh? How do you tell your wife about the 2 men who disappeared in the night and the sound the water made when they went under Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland returned to Tacoma, Washington? He went back to practicing law. He raised his family. He didn't talk about the Roberts much, not publicly, not for years. The Navy awarded him the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in naval combat. The citation described his extraordinary heroism and distinguished service. But Copeland carried something no medal could address. He had lost 129 of his 224 men, 115 killed in action, 14 more dead in the water during those 50 hours. He had given the order to abandon ship. He had watched his crew die around him for 3 hours. And then he had spent 2 days and 2 nights in the ocean, keeping the survivors alive by sheer force of will. Copeland lived until 1973. He was 61 when he died, 29 years after Samar. Former shipmates said he never fully recovered from the weight of the men he couldn't bring home. The families of the dead received telegrams. The Secretary of the Navy regrets to inform you. 115 families across America. Small towns, big cities, farm communities, industrial centers. Paul Carr's family in Checotah, Oklahoma received theirs in November 1944. Their son had been killed in action in the Philippine Sea. He was 20 years old. The telegram did not mention that he had died crawling toward his gun with his body torn open, holding a shell he couldn't fire, begging his crewmates to load it. That story came later, slowly, from the men who survived, from Chalmer Goheen, who had pried the shell from Carr's hands, from others who had seen what happened in the aft mount that morning. The full story of Paul Carr's last 5 minutes emerged piece by piece over the years, told at reunions, recorded in oral histories, written into official reports that were eventually declassified. And each time someone told it, the story grew not in exaggeration, but in understanding. People began to grasp what it meant for a dying man to refuse to stop fighting. Not because he thought he could win, not because he thought he would survive, but because the men on those carriers needed every second his gun could buy them, and Paul Carr was not going to stop buying seconds until his heart stopped beating. But the legacy of the Samuel B. Roberts and the Battle off Samar extends far beyond one ship and one crew. It fundamentally changed how the United States Navy thought about small ship tactics, escort vessel capabilities, and the doctrine of aggressive defense against superior forces. Before Samar, no destroyer escort had ever engaged enemy capital ships. The doctrine simply didn't exist. After Samar, the Navy studied every minute of the engagement. How Copeland used smokescreens. How Trowbridge exceeded engine specifications under combat conditions. How Burton and Carr fought their guns past every limitation the Navy had established. The tactical lessons were codified into new training manuals. The principle that aggressive action by inferior forces could disrupt and confuse a superior enemy became a cornerstone of small ship doctrine that influenced naval thinking through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and into the modern era. Today, the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis teaches the battle off Samar as one of the defining examples of leadership under impossible conditions. Every midshipman who passes through those gates studies what Copeland did, what Evans did on Johnston, what Thomas did on Howell. They study Paul Carr. They study a 20-year-old gunner who had every reason to quit and chose instead to die fighting. The Navy honored its dead in the way navies have honored their dead for centuries. They named ships after them. In 1982, the guided missile frigate USS Copeland, FFG-25, was commissioned. Robert Copeland had died 9 years earlier, but his family attended the ceremony. His name was painted on the hull of a warship that would serve for 14 years deployed to the Persian Gulf, the Mediterranean, the Pacific. In 1985, the guided missile frigate USS Carr FFG-52 was commissioned. Named for the gunner from Checkasaw. The ship served until 2013, 28 years of active duty. Deployments to the Middle East, counter-narcotics operations in the Caribbean, NATO exercises in the Atlantic. Every sailor who served aboard USS Carr knew the story, knew why their ship carried that name, knew about the 20-year-old kid who held a shell against his chest and refused to die until someone loaded it. Commander Ernest Evans of Johnston received the Medal of Honor posthumously, the only Medal of Honor awarded for the battle off Samar. Evans was Cherokee. He had told his crew at commissioning that this was a fighting ship, and he intended to go in harm's way. He kept that promise. Johnston fought for nearly 3 hours, taking hit after hit, until she finally sank with 186 of her 327 crew. Evans was never found. His body, like his ship, was lost to the Philippine Sea. The survivors held reunions every year. Small gatherings at first in hotel banquet rooms across America. Men who had shared the worst day of their lives coming together to remember it. The reunions grew. Families attended. Children and grandchildren of men who had died off Samar met the shipmates who had survived. Stories were told, retold, preserved. As the decades passed, the reunions grew smaller. Men aged. Men died. The generation that fought the war was disappearing. By 2010, fewer than a dozen Roberts survivors remained. By 2020, fewer than 5. The last surviving crew member of the Samuel B. Roberts was Adred Lenoir. He had been a seaman aboard the ship on October 25, 1944. He went into the water when she sank. He survived 50 hours in the Philippine Sea. He came home. He lived his life. He attended reunions for 77 years, and on March 20, 2022, Adred Lenoir died at his home at the age of 97. He was the last man alive who had stood on the deck of the Samuel B. Roberts. The last man who had heard Copeland's voice on the intercom, saying survival could not be expected. The last living connection to that morning off Samar. 3 months later in June 2022, a man named Victor Vescovo descended into the Philippine Sea in a deep submersible vehicle called Limiting Factor. Vescovo was a former Navy officer turned explorer who had already visited the deepest point in every ocean on Earth. He was searching for the Roberts. The Navy had approximate coordinates from 1944 action reports, but the ocean floor beneath those coordinates was more than 4 miles down. No conventional search technology could reach it. Vescovo's submersible could. He descended for hours. Pressure increased with every foot. At 22,621 feet, the submersible's lights illuminated something on the ocean floor. A ship, sitting upright, bow separated from the stern by the force of the impact when she hit bottom. But recognizable, unmistakably, a John C. Butler-class destroyer escort. The hull number was visible. DE-413. The Samuel B. Roberts. The deepest shipwreck ever discovered. Deeper than Titanic by nearly 10,000 feet. Deeper than Bismarck. Deeper than any warship that had ever been found on the ocean floor. She was sitting in absolute darkness, in near-freezing water, under pressure that would crush a submarine like a soda can. And she was intact enough to identify. The forward gun mount where Burton had fired 304 rounds was there. The torpedo tubes that had launched 3 duds at Chikuma were there. And the aft gun mount Cars mount, the place where a 20-year-old boy from Oklahoma had fought and bled and died holding his last shell was there. Visible in the camera footage, silent, still, waiting in the dark for 78 years. Audred Lenoir died 3 months before they found his ship. He never knew they had found her, never saw the footage, never got to see the aft mount one last time. 3 months. After 78 years of waiting, the last survivor and the discovery of the wreck missed each other by 90 days. There is a moment in every great story when the telling has to stop and the meaning has to speak for itself. This is that moment. On October 25, 1944, a ship weighing 1,745 tons, crewed by 224 men whose average age was 22, charged a fleet weighing 200,000 tons and fought for 3 hours until she was sunk. Her crew included a lawyer from Tacoma who became a captain, an engineer who ripped out safety systems because 24 knots was not enough, a gun captain who fired 304 rounds until his barrel glowed red, and a 20-year-old gunner from a town so small it barely appeared on maps who died holding a shell because he had decided that the fight was not over until he said it was over. They were not special. They were not chosen. They were ordinary men who had been together for 5 months and 27 days when the largest battleship ever built appeared on the horizon, and their captain told them survival could not be expected. And they fought anyway. Not because they wanted to die, because the men on those carriers behind them needed time. And time was the one thing the Samuel B. Roberts could give them, paid for in blood and steel and courage that defied every calculation the Japanese had made. 1,277 Americans died or went missing at the battle off Samar. But 200,000 troops at Leyte survived because 7 small ships refused to run. Military historians estimate the battle shortened the Pacific War by months. That means the men who fought and died off Samar, the crews of Roberts and Johnston and Howell and Gambier Bay, saved tens of thousands of lives that would have been lost in a longer war. That is their legacy, not medals, not ship names, not a wreck sitting 4 miles below the surface of the Philippine Sea. Lives. Thousands upon thousands of lives that continued because 224 ordinary men decided that doing what damage they could was enough reason to charge into the guns of the most powerful fleet on Earth. If this story stayed with you, share it. Tell someone about Paul Carr. Tell someone about Copeland and Trowbridge and Burton. Tell someone about a destroyer escort that fought like a battleship and a crew that measured courage, not in tonnage or firepower, but in the simple, impossible decision to keep fighting when every calculation said, stop. Subscribe to hear more stories of forgotten heroes who changed history. Leave a comment and tell us about the veterans in your family, because every family has a story, and every story deserves to be told. 78 years after she went down, the Samuel B. Roberts still rests at 22,621 feet, the deepest war grave on the planet. Paul Carr's gun mount is still there. The breach is still shattered. And if the ocean has a memory, then somewhere in that silence, in that absolute darkness, where no light has reached since the beginning of the world, a 20-year-old gunner is still holding his last shell, still pointing at the breach, still refusing to stop, because some men do not know how to quit. And some ships, even at the bottom of the sea, never stop fighting.